Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. We begin this evening with a briefing given by the army to legislators from the political opposition. The briefing touched upon the evolving security situation and threats in the region, especially in Afghanistan, which seems headed for either a total victory for the advancing Taliban or swaths of territory controlled by different groups, including the current government and its troops fighting for control. The three most important points of the briefing were: Pakistan has tried everything to convince the Afghan Taliban to work out a peace and power-sharing deal with the Kabul government, but they have refused to do that. Afghan Taliban and Pakistani terrorist group TTP share the same ideology and objectives. President Ashraf Ghani's government is fully aware of Pakistan's efforts but continues to take an anti-Pakistan position, which is exacerbating the situation. There's a real threat that Taliban will capture Kabul with force. We are not giving bases to the United States, but it is using air corridors as per a previous agreement. Our relations with China take precedence despite the US pressure. We want to have good relations with both. As should be obvious, the first 3 points are vital, especially the one about Afghan Taliban and the terrorist TTP. Our discussion this evening focuses on emerging threats and whether Pakistan is prepared or is preparing itself to counter them. I'm joined by Dr. Adil, inaugural Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Dr. Najam has previously served as Vice Chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Sciences, and Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Thank you to both my guests. Let me begin with Dr. Adil Najam. So, Adil, what do you think of the salient points? Of course, I mean, there was a lot more also in terms of discussion, but the salient points are very important, starting with, I think, and I think from Pakistan's perspective, that's a very important one. The sort of, the similarity in ideology and objectives of the Afghan Taliban as also the terrorist TTP.
I think in ways, amongst the most important things that happened was the fact that there was a briefing. And such briefings, I think, are always important. It was in camera, but of the things that came out, including the summary that you gave, it also constituted not just a briefing to the Pakistan Parliament, but in some ways a articulation of how Pakistan security apparatus is viewing this fast-growing and extremely troubling crisis. So that in itself, I think, separate from the substance of the briefing, the happening of the briefing, the event itself, I think, was of political importance in Pakistan and I think of narrative importance to the rest of the world. Having said that, I think the key message in some ways, and the one that you highlighted, is this sort of growing sense that Pakistan is seen to be too close to the Taliban. Despite Pakistan trying to say that it is distant, and there are good reasons. There are reasons for that which are historical. There are reasons for that are geographical, and this very, very strong distancing from the Taliban, in terms of how much influence or leverage Pakistan may actually have on the Taliban by virtue of the fact that some of the families of the leaders may be living in parts of Pakistan. So first, in distancing that influence, and then also, I think, in highlighting what the threat to Pakistan is from Taliban or TTP and so on and so forth. Because in the muddle, in the confusion about the situation, that is not really appreciated outside of Pakistan to the same magnitude. So people in Pakistan understand that even if there is some influence, it is not a type of influence that is close and all-embracing. So that, I think, was a very, very important message, both in terms of that influence has always been limited, and B, in terms of that influence may be waning. And Pakistan's own perception of how this situation threatens Pakistan may be increasing.
Right. Yes, we'll return to the issue of Pakistan's influence over the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. But let me invite Kamran to say something about this very important salient point with reference to the similarity in ideology and objectives of TTP and Afghan Taliban.
Jaz, this is important, and it's actually a positive sign that it is now being acknowledged, because, as you know, in years past, there's been the narrative of good and versus bad Taliban, the good being the ones who fight in Afghanistan and are under the influence of the Pakistan, versus the Taliban, the TTP, who fight in Pakistan, try to topple the Pakistani state, have links to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Look, here in Washington, and for many of us who have been following this for years, we didn't see much of a difference. The only thing we saw was that for strategic reasons, basically you don't, fight where you live. That was the principle of the Afghan Taliban, in the sense that they didn't attack Pakistan. It was the TTP. But for all the influence that Pakistan enjoyed with the Afghan Taliban over the years, it did not help in Pakistan being able to counter the TTP, because there are linkages, there are ethnic linkages, tribal linkages. These people have fought with each other together before the founding of the TTP. A lot of its leading figures saw combat in Afghanistan in years past. And therefore, the question was that, what is this artificial divide? And it's good to see that, in Pakistan, at the highest levels of the military and political leadership, that this is being acknowledged. Now, the question is, what do we do about it?
Right. Now, talk about what can be done about it. Firstly, it now creates the problem of how we are going to deal with the Afghan Taliban. This is for you, Adil Najam, extrapolating from what Kamran has said. So in the event that there is no clear winner in the interim, Ghani's government controls Kabul, certain other urban centers, some of the districts, while the Taliban advance and capture some more territory, but obviously cannot capture other urban centers. That's one scenario. The other scenario can be that you also have the militias, you have ISIS, you have the TTP and other freelancers in ungoverned spaces. Then the other scenario could be that ultimately the Taliban do emerge as victors. So in terms of looking at the situation, in terms of how these scenarios would clearly impact Pakistan's approach or approaches to Afghanistan, give me a sense of how that's going to play out, in terms of the different scenarios that we just talked about.
It's going to be hell. It's going to be hell. And this is not going to be an easy issue. In some ways, the Pakistan position has been, even before this briefing, and is I think the right one, but not an easy one, which is that Pakistan should be preparing to deal with Afghanistan and not with a party in Afghanistan. Now, that doesn't take away the fact that there are parties and they are fighting, and we are not heading towards. We are in the middle of a massive civil war, and have been for a long time. But that position and constantly reasserting that is an important one. Partly because countries deal with countries as a rule, and partly because what happens between now and then is so uncertain, unclear, that any scenario exercise that you and I do will be insufficient, because I can immediately think of 5 or 6 other scenarios. It seems clear that the US is going to leave Afghanistan in a bigger mess than it found it in terms of any form of governance. It seems clear that it is not going to leave at a point when a clear victor is already certain. It's certainly not going to be Mr. Ghani, it seems, from current standing, but nor is it likely that it's going to be the Taliban have swept through and taken control, that there isn't going to be someone to take control back from the US when it leaves. It seems likely that not only conflict will continue, and this to me is my most important point, but realignments and realliances will also continue, which has been the history of Afghanistan forever. I'm going back now to the Soviet invasion and so on and so forth. So to assume that whatever eventual settlement happens or whatever eventual sort of balancing happens is merely going to be a balancing between what we currently call Taliban and what we currently call Kabul, I think is not necessarily correct. That what we call Kabul is also in a state of flux. And it could be that if the Taliban are in a state of flux, the other forces, whether they are militia, whether they are other even more extremist groups, will create a new configuration. Now, recall this, and both you and Kamran have worked a very long time on these issues. When the Soviets left, there was no such thing. Well, when the Soviets came, there was no such thing as the Mujahideen. When the Soviets left, there was no such thing as the Taliban. When the Americans came in, there was no such thing as what we today call ISIS. So in all of these configurations, it would not at all be surprising if we start talking about a different name in a year from now as they realign, because the essential element here is control of power. And you are seeing, in many of the things we are seeing, whether it is the behavior of the Afghan military itself in certain areas, whether it is in local governments and local governors, is the creation of a new polity in a constantly changing polity.
Right, but my issue here is that obviously looking at this evolving situation, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you talk about one scenario and, you think of 3 or 4 more. But the government of Pakistan currently, technically, legally, diplomatically, recognizes Ashraf Ghani's government. When the ground situation begins to change, as it is likely to, who exactly will we be able to recognize? One answer can be that whoever has a seat in the United Nations. But that's kind of a technical answer. It doesn't really fully cover the reality on the ground.
You're exactly right. And I did not answer that question. Your question is a very good one in some ways, and I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out. I do not think now is the time for Pakistan. Now may be the time for Pakistan to think about it, but it's certainly not the time for Pakistan to articulate. Because any articulation of this response is necessarily going to sound like choosing sides. And that is partly behind sort of the even higher tension between Mr. Ghani and between Kabul and Islamabad right now. But in many ways, this rhetoric of saying we will deal with Afghanistan is an important one to continue. My own sense is that not only will the question of the reality on the ground versus the seat in the United Nations be important for Pakistan because of its geography and its proximity, the important question will also be that if, as is likely at this point, the dispensation in Kabul is dominated by the Taliban and is dominated not only by Taliban individuals but by Taliban ideology, then the question might come up, as it has in the past, that a lot of countries will not be wanting to recognize them. And then
Absolutely.
What does Pakistan do? Because it's this pressure, and there may also be pressure, as we've seen before, for having someone who's kind of a postman to Kabul.
Right.
A role that Pakistan has played before. And I think that's also not a role that Pakistan should be at least articulating at this point, because it is not something that's beneficial.
Right. And Imran Bukhari, you know this because you've worked on the security and emerging threats in areas like Libya, Syria, Iraq. Now, we know that a number of countries, for instance, in Libya, A number of countries back Khalifa Haftar. A number of other countries back the UN-recognized government. It's the same in Syria. And there are clear alignments. Now, for Pakistan, if truth be spoken, the strategic alliance at the subterranean level leads to the Afghan Taliban. But at the government-to-government level, it's always been, the Kabul government first, the transitional government after the US invasion, then Hamid Karzai, then Ashraf Ghani. So it becomes a kind of interesting conundrum, if you will, of how Pakistan will approach the issue of any kind of recognition based on the ground situation. So give me your thoughts on that.
So, look, I'm going to pick up from your article from last Friday, and I want to take it a little step further. You basically said that Pakistan should develop the capability to act in a cross-border manner. And I'm going to say, look, yes, countries, external forces, external powers do operate in areas that are, subject to civil war, becoming ungoverned spaces, contested spaces, strategic vacuums. So from at the subterranean level, yes, the Pakistanis have, it's very clear, have, swung in the direction of the Taliban. My view is that if there is a consensus now in Islamabad that a Taliban, dominated Afghanistan in the future, in the near future, is extremely dangerous for Pakistan, then it only makes logical sense that Pakistan does not allow that to happen. Create and establish a balance of power between the two sides. And there's no better time to do that than when the battle space is hot, when the other side, which the Pakistanis have not had good relations over the years, need help. And if Pakistan comes and says, okay, we are not going to allow Taliban to take over, and using, military support or whatever it is, we can get into the details of that. We can have a conversation about that. But strategically speaking, maintaining a balance of power between what we call the Taliban camp and the anti-Taliban camp. Yes, Adil is absolutely right that, these are shifting lines. And this is a situation in flux. The battle lines will change and whatnot. But for the foreseeable future, let's just call one side the Taliban and then the anti-Taliban. And of course, people will switch sides and whatnot. But that's for later. Right now, this line must be held if you don't want to see an Afghanistan dominated by the Taliban, which will then render Afghanistan a sanctuary for all sorts of terrorist groups, all sorts of jihadist groups from different countries, transnational ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and whatever is to come in the future. So this is something that Pakistan must do. I think it can be done. It just needs a lot of courage, creativity, and the need to do what is called, the strategic paradigm shift.
Right. Since in my article, Kamran, let me just say that my own sense and the reason I wrote that and the manner in which I've argued about developing offensive counterterrorism capabilities had to do with the fact that, we don't need to, we need to sort of shield ourselves from what's happening in Afghanistan, and B, instead of taking any clear position with reference to either the Kabul government or the Taliban, or let me use what you have said, either the Taliban or the assortment of anti-Taliban forces, while being able to pick up early intelligence and strike at targets that we consider, or Pakistan considers as an emerging or imminent threat. So is that something that would make sense for you?
Yes, but I would take it a bit step further. Don't look at this as sort of like a tactical thing, whether it's tactical intelligence, tactical strike capability. Why let the situation get to the point where you're having to go in and do some heavy lifting? Why not maintain a balance of power where you don't have those groups that are, because look, no country does things for free. Pakistan has to have something in it for itself to be able to do this. And that something is that you don't want your Western flank to be dominated by groups that are non-state actors or state actors that are adversaries to Pakistan. So the only way to do that is to maintain that balance of power. So where you, until there's a time when both sides are exhausted and they can come to the table. We keep talking about intra-Afghan dialogue. I always thought that was premature, and the Taliban have no incentive to come to the negotiating table with their Afghan adversaries, and you need to create that incentive. So if you do that, then you don't have to go in and sort of mow the lawn and say, oh, I got intelligence, let me go do an airstrike in position X because the enemies of Pakistan are gathering there for an attack. That is something that may become necessary, but at this stage, it has to be looked at far more strategically than tactically.
Okay. I'm also now joined by Senator Anwarul Haq Kakar from the Balochistan Awami Party. Anwar is obviously someone who knows Balochistan very well. Also, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has dealt with the issue of terrorism and counterterrorism capabilities in Balochistan as well as in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Anwar, thank you for being on the program. One of the things that we were discussing with reference to the security briefing has to do with the fact that it's been said that the Afghan Taliban and the terrorist TTP share the same ideology and they have the same objectives. Now, there seems to be a major shift in terms of threat perception from previous years, at least overtly. It's the first time. So give us a sense of what the thinking behind this is.
I absolutely agree that probably for the first time it has been exhibited on a public forum, or even if it is an in-camera session, that the state institutions, they have enunciated that there is no differentiation between the two groups as far as their ideology is concerned or their same source of inspiration is concerned. But at the moment, I think so the more immediate challenge is that how do we respond to the emerging situation in Afghanistan? I could not hear your worthy other speakers, but in my opinion, the urgency or the sense of urgency is if there is a forceful takeover by Taliban in Kabul, how Pakistan should respond? This is the million-dollar question. And my own personal view is the status quo continues for another, let's say, 6 months, a year, 2, what sort of implications that will create for the state of Pakistan and our measured responses? What should be our measured responses? So very challenging times. Very challenging times. We need to have a very profound and deep thinking. First of all, let's talk about the kinetic or the military responses. Can or should we apply the force tool when it comes to the Afghan soil? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a sovereign country, whether it has a central government or not, or a strong central government which is in control. But still, in theory, it's a sovereign nation, it's a sovereign country. Would it be tantamount to attack a neighboring country if we apply that tool? And if we don't, if the threat is coming, will we counter that on our own soil? So it has tactical questions, tactical challenges, strategic challenges, and all these options were discussed and brought in on the table, and the thought process is still going on. I mean, there is no clear position.
So it's good to know that at least there is a process going on. But would you agree with me, Anwar, that this is something that requires that we expedite our thinking processes and also formulating the policy and also then actually, training for it?
I completely agree with you. I mean, there is no second opinion on that. But the issue is that the Afghan mosaic is so complicated that no matter whomsoever claims to be the authority in Afghan affairs, cannot be prescient that what is going on. I mean, what is the thinking of PTA? Are they planning to forcefully take over the capital, or they are just focusing this time more on law? They are encouraging more peaceful surrenders. Will there be more violence or relatively less violence? And how the Indians and the rest of their allies are arming the opponent militias. I mean, it's a very grave situation.
Right.
When these groups are being armed openly, with Abdullah Saleh and so on and so forth, the others, by the regional powers. So how would you respond to these strategic challenges? Everyone is contesting for the influence, or at least having some sort of a stake within Afghanistan. So if that stake is created through negative input or through negative contribution, armed contribution, so Pakistan should respond in the same coin, or we should remain aloof of all these new developments. So it requires very serious thinking.
Right. It requires very serious thinking, that's for sure. Thank you so much. That was Senator Anwarul Haq Kakar speaking with us. Dr. Adil Najam, it seems to me that obviously the situation is very complex. It's a wicked problem, in fact. Do you think that we need to, get to the drawing board, think of all kinds of scenarios, and then work out policies and approaches with reference to all the scenarios, so that we are prepared and we have contingency planning also?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. But, it is a wicked problem. That's the exact right word. But we should certainly start by not making the wicked problem any worse than it is. So I have tremendous respect for Kamran. So I say this with all of that. But if I can take a part of what Kamran said. Kamran said that Pakistan should change the balance of power in Afghanistan, should not let the Taliban win. And he said we can do it. First of all, I'm not sure that's Pakistan's role in a country, and I say that very seriously, not just as a statement. And B, I am absolutely certain that Pakistan cannot do it. That would be absolutely arrogant and wrong if the United States of America, with all this money, for 19 years, with all of its military might, couldn't do that. To change the balance of power in Afghanistan. That's exactly the only thing they were trying to do, right? To control the Taliban. To assume that Pakistan can somehow do that, I think just goes counter everything. Of all the countries, Pakistan, where we have trouble, getting water from a tap and light from an electric bulb, is unlikely to do that. I do not wish to antagonize Pakistani sensibilities. But we have never had, do not have, will not have the capability to do that. And in some ways, I think there's this sort of sense that, if a country is giving the U.S. tough time, there must be someone outside who's giving them such support, whether it's North Korea or so on and so forth. So I think that is something Pakistan should stay as far away as possible. There is no dearth of enemies for Pakistan. There is no dearth. It's not like we are not self-sufficient in that already. To create one. Now, again, I go back. This is why it is a wicked problem. It is a tough problem. That Pakistan has to have relations of some sort or others with Afghanistan, not with the Taliban, not with a particular faction, both because it is changing and because we are not capable. I will also take, if I can, one very short sense of pushback on something you said. I do not think Pakistan has had influence. The Taliban have had Pakistan by the neck, or choose your body part. and it's not Pakistan has influence on. I would have chosen
a different body part, but go ahead.
The Taliban have Pakistan in a really trapped Pakistan in a really difficult situation because they have the ability to hurt immediately. And this too is not new. No, this is not new at all. This has been throughout. Now, please tell me the one time when Pakistan has had the ability, again, I do not mean to offend my Pakistani friends, but when have we the ability actually to tell Taliban stand and they stood, sit and they sat. The best we've ever been able to do is to get messages across and be able to get someone on the table and maybe politely say something or other. I think Pakistan is exaggerated to its own detriment.
That's a very interesting point. But we have had a little more debate on this, but I'm running out of time. So let me just go to Kamran Bukhari. So Kamran, what are you going to say? I was actually going to return to you with what Dr. Adil Najam has said, but now that he has said it, just respond to that before I wrap up this segment.
Look, I mean, there are risks. And I said this, what I said needs to be unpacked. What I said needs to be better, explained. So I'll try to do that in the limited time that we have. So look, when I say, I'm not saying change the balance of power. And I'm saying that just prevent, there is enough that can be done. Pakistan has traditionally enabled the Taliban. So if you assist the other side, then there is a fighting chance where the Taliban do not just sort of take over and you have a bigger problem. And as far as what the U.S. was or wasn't able to do, Pakistan has far more influence at the subterranean level in Afghanistan than the United States. It's an extra-regional power that came in and was reliant on Pakistan for a great amount. And which is why there were tensions between Pakistan and the United States, is that the Americans felt that the Pakistanis were not doing all that they can. And this is no secret. The Pakistanis have never helped the other side. I'm not saying this is a perfect solution, but what else does Pakistan have? Should it not do anything else and just wait for the Taliban to take over? That's not an acceptable scenario from a Pakistani national security point of view. So these are absolutely wicked, whatever term we want to use, difficult, dire times. And it is in these moments that you think out of the box and you take risks, because risk is always part of this equation. The alternative is even uglier. And yes, will the Taliban, retaliate? Of course. But if they dominate, then their allies and their counterparts in Pakistan are going to emerge, and it's going to be a horrendous scenario for Pakistan. I don't think anybody's debating that. I'm just saying, let's think outside the box. Let's try to do what we've not done.
That's a very important point. And I expect that, for all the wrong reasons, if I might say that, we will be returning to this wicked problem. And we'll continue to return to this. It doesn't make me happy, but I think that's what the ground situation seems to indicate. But thank you so much to Dr. Adil Najam, to Dr. Kamran Bukhari. We shall take a short break and return to discuss a statement by China's State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, urging the United States to return to the Iran nuclear deal. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. State Councillor and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has urged the United States to lift sanctions imposed on Iran and rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal, technically known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The deal is the subject of multilateral negotiations underway in Vienna for 3 months. Wang was speaking at the annual World Peace Forum organized by Tsinghua University and the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs. The U.S. should correct its mistakes, Wang said. It should fully and completely remove all its illegal and unilateral sanctions on Iran and any third party to meet Iran halfway and make further breakthroughs in the negotiations, unquote. Washington is reportedly ready to remove many sanctions, but it demands that Iran first return to full compliance with JCPOA. Iran has increased both the quantity and quality of its uranium enrichment, getting closer to what is needed for a nuclear bomb, which is actually what the Western observers say, but is not really a fact. But in order to discuss this further, I'm joined by a Tangan, a political and economic affairs commentator in Beijing, Syed Mustafa Khoshcheshm in Tehran. Mustafa is a journalist and analyst who has taught at a number of Iranian universities and academic centers. And Dr. Gordon Adams. Dr. Adams is Professor Emeritus at American University's School of International Service. Let me begin with Professor Adams here. Professor Adams, your thoughts on what Wang Yi said. Interestingly, on the sidelines of the forum, he also said that China hopes to resume high-level dialogue with the United States. However, he said it depends on whether the U.S. is sincere. So it seems to me a lot of signaling is also going on here.
Yes, this is a small step for China because, of course, China is a party to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and they have been actively involved in the discussions that have been going on for the last few months about the restoration of that agreement and the reentry of the United States into the agreement. So there's nothing terribly surprising in the statement. He said it before, and he'll probably say it again. It is, though, from the Chinese perspective, I think a much larger engagement with the United States that the foreign minister and President Xi have been talking about. It's not surprising to hear this statement because we are really viewing a rather comprehensive rebalancing of the international system right now. And the Chinese, in a number of respects, have been very active, particularly with Iran, where a month or so ago, China signed a 25-year agreement with Iran that would provide for about $400 billion worth of Chinese investment in Iran in exchange for a guaranteed supply of oil, the commodity that the Chinese do not produce, but really need to continue the rather strongly growing Chinese economy. So this is a small statement in the middle of a very grand strategy of Chinese engagement in the world and a rebalancing of a system, with China being, in fact, quite assertive about what it sees as a leadership role that it has in the international system.
Now, very interesting point with reference to rebalancing and China playing a role, because China has, in fact, over the past some years been actually laying claim to that leadership role as also having been one of the parties to the security post-Second World War security architecture, in essence saying to the United States, well, you know, we have always been there, and, you know, this and China has also been advancing multilateralism and pointing to the United States and saying, well, you guys have been getting out of multilateral arrangements. So it seems to me that this is part of that. You know, I mean, I'm actually corroborating what you said.
Yes, I think that's it's a long and historic trend here, and one that has been very strongly asserted by President Xi recently. The famous speech that he gave on the moment of the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, which basically said, don't have any delusions about China's role in the world. And he's asserting that role at a time when the United States, I would say, is considerably challenged. President Biden has been making strong steps towards reasserting America's role in relationship with its allies, has been quite confrontational with respect to China. But the United States is very challenged domestically, politically, very challenged domestically, economically, and President Biden knows that he is going to have to do an awful lot to restore the American economy before other countries are going to trust American leadership internationally. So I think this is just another sign of a very real, not asserted, but very real rebalancing and reassertion of multilateral leadership, with China playing a very strong and global diplomatic role.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Professor Gordon Adams speaking with us. Mustafa Khoshcheshm, what do you make of what Wang Yi said? I mean, Professor Adams has said that this is essentially part of the larger sort of Chinese assertion of multilateralism and China's own role on the world stage.
True. I do agree with your other guests in vast parts. Let me explain a little bit about some other aspects. The Americans were involved with the Middle East in order to impose their hegemonic rule in this part of the world when they really needed crude more than anyone else, and they were totally dependent on crude reserves in this part of the world. Now, they have reduced their dependence. It's not true that they have cut off all their dependence. They still are in need of heavy crude, but with regard to light crude, after the shale oil and gas production, they've become an exporter. They plan to impose their rule over the Middle East and then rush to Chinese territories, of the region in the Far East, in East Asia, in order to challenge the Chinese fast economic growth. It took them somewhere about 15 years or so, and they were involved in the Middle East, and Iran's activities and roles in the region stopped the U.S. plan in this part. So the Americans believe that they have lost time, and Chinese are going to the point of nowhere in their economic growth, to be followed by political leadership and security leadership in the world. Therefore, they've decided to change a strategy after two major defeats in this region against Iran. Now they are leaving the region, actually, from Afghanistan to Qatar. They are leaving bases and withdrawing forces to lands near Israel in order to reduce forces and equipment to start the pivot to the east that was to start under Obama, and it never started. In the meantime, they've been trying to increase expenses for the Chinese economy. They've created hotbed of tensions in lands surrounding China, from North Korea to Afghanistan and elsewhere, all to pose increasing risks to Chinese economy. In the meantime, we need to remember that Iran is the most cost-benefit, the best route, actually, for the Chinese Silk Road, or One Road, One Belt, initially, or whatever they call it. And that means a lot to the Chinese. So Chinese want restoration of peace and stability in this region, because it's a very necessary part, a vital part to their economic growth. They want to expand.
Okay, Mustafa, I get you. Let me jump to, because time is short, let me jump to another point here for your very quick response. Now, some of the aspects, the negotiations in Vienna, there is the clean text. So the clean text is, of course, clean, but what exactly is the sticking point right now? Is it about who does what first? Is it about sequencing? Is it about simultaneity? What is it about?
Well, about everything. It takes a lot of time to explain, but let me tell you something very important. Since there were many differences between Iran and the United States, so they decided to just jot down the common points that both sides agree first, and then deal with the differences. Now, they are exactly at those differences. These differences are all mentioned in Iran's conditions. None of the Iranian conditions have been met by the U.S. Iran has requested that all American sanctions after the JCPOA was struck should be removed. And then the United States should take first actions, because the last time we did it under Obama, we lost a lot. We complied in full, but they never did anything to our benefit. And then after verification of 3 to 6 months, Tehran would start resuming all its undertakings. None of these three has happened. The United States has not agreed to any of these parts.
So what are the chances of this agreement?
Well, the two sides say that there needs to be political decision making. It's right. This means that one of the two should surrender. I believe the Iranians are standing very much firm on their, conditions, and there is logical reason for that, because they know under the present conditions that have been offered by the United States, Tehran's economy would be like a hostage in the U.S. under U.S. sanctions if Iran agrees to these terms. So I've been hearing some unofficial, reports from Vienna that the Americans might be ready to give a little bit, not much, more, and show more flexibility until the end of the Rouhani administration, because they know once Raisi comes to office, he has a full package of confrontational approach in order to pressure the U.S. agree to Iran's terms.
Okay.
I do not see much chance, but I don't say that it's dead already. So
Right.
we need to wait for the next few weeks.
That's a very important and interesting point with reference to flexibility before Raisi takes over. Thank you so much. I realize, Mustafa, because it is a very complex issue, but unfortunately the time is short, but I suspect we'll have another outing with reference to this. Thank you so much. That was Syed Mustafa Khosh-Chesham. Aina Tangan, you've been listening to all this very patiently. Give me your thoughts about, of course, one, the signaling that Wang Yi has done, which Professor Adams also referred to, China's understanding of its role on the world stage, and finally, the point about JCPOA.
Well, I thought Gordon's position was, he espoused a very, very balanced position. I would disagree just slightly in terms of China trying to be the aggressor here. They really do feel that in Beijing that Washington has been putting the pressure on them, and they're simply responding. They want to keep a world order, which they perceive the U.S. is walking away from. I would agree with Gordon on that. In terms of what kind of signaling is there, I don't think it's changed. If you go back to 2018, if you go to 2020, in fact, every year, China has reiterated the same exact position that the U.S. needs to come back to the table and do the right thing, not walk away from this. But, to address the overall situation, I think it's a lot easier than perhaps Mustafa was putting forward. Right now, Biden is concentrated almost entirely on the politics. He's a weak president. He does not have a Senate majority that will allow him to pass the policies he wants, and he's intent on getting that in the midterm elections. He thinks he has a very good shot with Donald Trump kind of dividing the Republican field, perhaps turning off Republican voters, and that could lead to a number of turnovers in the Democrats' favor. So once he gets that, I think he has a much freer hand. But any kind of give in to Iran at this point would, just send the Republican talk show hosts going crazy, saying that he has given away America, that he's a threat, et cetera. And he wants to avoid that. He wants to keep things in neutral until that happens. So I don't think anyone should expect anything to happen between them. But this points to a really much larger issue, and that is the U.S. continues to kind of politicize things that should not be politicized. Nuclear arms is not something where you should say, well, in the balance of things, I want to stay in power and all this kind of stuff. Neither is the scientific facts of a COVID-19. A pandemic is a pandemic. You can't solve it with politics. And also on the economic front, this idea of, kind of passing lip service to things like a 15% minimum tax, when what the world needs is probably 25%, especially to balance things out for developing countries. That's not enough, and there needs to be a more coordinated world plan. So that's the issue. You cannot play politics with certain issues, especially when they are, life and death or things that have immediate needs. Unfortunately, he's a long-term politician, and he's not going to change his stripes or his spots.
Okay, so Aina, very quickly, I was talking separately, of course, not on camera, with one of the leading China experts based in Oxford. And he made an interesting point with reference to the U.S. approach, and said that, of course, there are these concerns, human rights concerns, with reference to Xinjiang, with reference to what's happening in Hong Kong. His point was that the Biden administration would perhaps be able to voice these concerns and actually get Beijing to ameliorate the situation if it approaches Beijing in a cooperative rather than a confrontational framework. Is that something you would agree with?
No, not at this point. I mean, the time for that was quite some time ago. Beijing feels very much that it's under threat from the United States. What you see, the reaction in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang and in Tibet, and even towards even towards Formosa, as it's called, or Taiwan, is this issue that they're feeling they're being attacked, that the U.S. is trying to use as leverage these weak points. So you see China embarking on a Sinonization plan. They want to bring these areas the same way that they dealt with the areas within China. Remember, if you go back to 1949, there was a whole mixture of languages. People couldn't talk to each other. They could read, if they could read, the same characters, and they knew the meanings. But China it's a new country. It wants to teach its history the way it sees it. It wants to teach about its economic success, the way it's done it, and it wants to make sure that there are opportunities available for all. So right now you have Western countries saying, well, we suspect, we hear smoke, we see smoke, we suspect there's a fire, but the smoke is, in China's eyes, is being sent up by the CIA, not by their actual actions, unfortunately. The Chinese are not good at PR. And they have, I think, mishandled that in terms of not allowing more sunlight in terms of the press actually seeing the situation on the ground.
And I remember we discussed it earlier also on this program, but thank you so much. As always, that was Einar Tangen speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.